The Melting Middleweight. Sugar Ray and the Milling Cove. Part of the pleasure of going to a fight is reading the newspapers next morning to see what the sports writers think happened. This pleasure is prolonged, in the case of a big bout, by the fight films. You can go to them to see what did happen. What you eventually think you remember about the fight will be an amalgam of what you thought you saw there, what you read in the papers you saw, and what you saw in the films. The films are especially insidious. During the last 20 seconds or so of the fight between Sugar Ray Robinson and Randy Turpin, for example, it seemed to me from where I sat in the lower stand at the Polo Grounds that Robinson hit the failing Turpin with every blow he threw, a succession of smashing hits such as I had never before seen a fighter take without going down. The films show that Robinson missed quite a few of them, and that Turpin, although not able to hit back, was putting up some defensive action until the last second, swaying low, with his gloves shielding his sad face, gray-white in the films. It was the face of a schoolboy who has long trained himself not to cry under punishment, and who has had endless chances to practice, like an inmate of Do the Boys Hall. That's the way I now catch myself remembering Turpin's face in the last seconds, although I couldn't see it at the Polo Grounds because Robinson was between us and both were a good distance from me anyway. The face isn't gray-white in real life, but a kind of dun. The films of the first 9 rounds of the fight upset my original impressions in the same way. Those rounds seem exciting now because I look for hints of what is to come in the 10th, which contained all the fight's excitement. I forget that when they were being fought, I saw them only as 9 very bad rounds, almost a hoax on the 61,370 spectators, who, in the consecrated formula, had paid $767,630 for the privilege of watching them. All they seemed likely to lead to was 6 more bad rounds and a decision that would be sure to provoke an argument, since the boxers were going nowhere at the same pace. In the 3rd, or maybe the 4th round, the fans in the general admission seats began to clap in unison, as they do at small clubs when 2 preliminary boys either can't or won't fight. I wondered if either Robinson or Turpin had ever before been treated so disrespectfully. Their styles seemed just made to reduce each other to absurdity. But years from now, when I reminisce about the fight, I'll probably say it was tense all the way, and I'll believe it. I still think the referee, Ruby Goldstein, was right to stop the fight. No referee should take it upon himself to gamble on a man's recuperative powers. One more punch like the ones Robinson was throwing might have ended the boxing days of any fighter, even Turpin, who was what Boxiana would have called a prime glutton. Boxiana is one of my favorite books, and because of the international nature of the fight, I had a refresher glance at it before going up to the Polo Grounds. On the night of the fight, I started out early in the true Egan tradition. In his time, the migration to a fight would begin days in advance, when the foot toddlers, fellows who couldn't afford horse-drawn transportation, would set out on the road for the rumored meeting place. Rumors were all they had to go on, because in England at that time prize fighting, although patronized by the Prince Regent, was illegal. A day or so later, the Milling Coves and the Flash Coves, fighters and knowing boys, would set out in wagons or hackneys, with plenty of Cyprians and Blue Ruin, sporting girls and gin, to keep them happy on their way. The Cyprians counted on making new and more profitable connections later. Last of all, the Corinthians, amateurs of the fancy and patrons of pugilists, would take the road in their fast traps and catch up with the others in time to get their bets down before the fight. But Blue Ruin stopped many a wagon before it got there. Milling Coves and Flash Coves both were lushing coves. Attendance at an old-time British fight was preceded, for all classes, by a visit to the pubs of the contending heroes to wish them success. In accordance with this tradition, at 6 o'clock on the evening of the Robinson-Turpin fight, I made my way to Sugar Ray's, which is Robinson's pub, on the west side of 7th Avenue between 123rd and 124th Streets. Improvements in transportation have made it unnecessary to start for a fight days in advance, unless one is to foot-toddle. I approached the pub by taxi, the equivalent of a hackney, but sans Cyprian, and disembarked on the northeast corner of 7th Avenue and 124th Street in front of the Citadel of Hope Mission, which was not getting much of a play. I got out there because if I'd got out on the Robinson side of the street, I'd have had to step on somebody's feet. With the time to go to the fight drawing near, the sidewalk in front of his bar and grill had vanished. The sidewalk in front of the Hotel Teresa, which extends from 124th to 125th Street on the west side of 7th Avenue, was similarly jammed with Harlemites, and the narrow traffic island in the middle of the avenue was also filled with Negroes who were gazing up at the hotel. A small colored boy, presumably from the Citadel of Hope, handed me a throwaway preaching class war. "There are two classes of people in the world, the righteous and the wicked," it read. "You belong to one of these two classes. Which?" "Let me ask you a question," I said to the boy. "Who was up in that hotel?" "Randy," the boy answered. "He's resting until the fight." I looked about me and imagined the trade consequences of a Turpin victory. I could visualize the thousands of shoulders draped in British tweed, and the equal number of feet now impacted one on another, encased in shoes by Maxwell of Dover Street. In Harlem, fashion follows the brave. It seemed to me I could already detect a slight premonitory change in the accent of the first man who spoke to me, but he may have been a West Indian. "Randy is superior," he said. "He's overconfident. I mean, he feel no fear." I crossed the street and worked my way into the lobby of the Teresa, which is the largest hotel under Negro management in America and about the busiest hotel anywhere, a contrast to its moribund last 20 years in white hands. Joe Louis was standing, almost unnoticed, with a group of friends near the door. He's still a favorite, but no novelty. Everybody was waiting for a look at Randy. Coming out of the Teresa, I stood on the inner edge of the sidewalk and allowed myself to be propelled slowly half a block downtown, being carried past the Golden Glover's barber shop and the storefront office of Ray Robinson Enterprises. Robinson is in almost as many businesses in Harlem as Father Divine was before that divinity moved to Philadelphia. I detached myself from the current just in time to duck into Sugar Ray's, which is a narrow but deep saloon with walls of blue glass chips tastefully picked out with gold. The bar was as crowded as the street outside, but at the back of the place, where the bar ends, Sugar Ray's widens out enough to permit 3 parallel rows of tables, 1 row against each side wall, and the third between them, and there were a few empty seats. Since I could find no place to stand up, I sat down at a table. This rear section of Sugar Ray's is decorated with 4 huge photo montages, 2 on each side wall. 2 show him making a fool of Kid Gavilan, the Cuban fighter, who is a competitor of his for local fame. Another shows Robinson bringing an expression of intensely comic pain to the face of the French middleweight Robert Villemain, a muscle-bound picnic type with a square head. The 4th shows him standing above Georgie Abrams, a skillful pugilist who is so hairy that when knocked down he looks like a rug. Abrams got up after his knockdown, but from the picture it doesn't seem as if he ever would. I asked a man at the table next to mine, who looked like an old colored milling cove, whether the boss was around, and he said he wasn't. "He left about an hour ago," he said. "He's taking this one serious. He was carrying his bag, and I told him, 'Now don't you stop on the way to do any training.'" Some women at the Cove's table laughed, and so did I. I dined on bourbon and the largest, pinkest pork chops I have ever seen, priced at $1.65. "They're mighty good," I said to the Cove, who seemed to be regarding me with interest. "They ought to be," he said. "I once fought a man 8 rounds for not much more than that." I approved of Robinson's decision to leave early. Drinking with customers just before a battle was a practice deprecated by Egan. There was, to give you an example from Boxiana, Dan Donnelly, an Irish heavyweight who was never beaten but who fell dead in his own bar after drinking 47 whiskey punches with well-wishers. His epitaph read, "O'erthrown by punch, unharmed by fist, he died unbeaten pugilist." A slim, earnest black man with a briar pipe in his right hand walked down between the tables, saying in a peremptory voice, "100 to 75, 100 to 75. "What you betting?" another man asked him. "I bet Robinson," the man with the pipe said. "Everybody here betting him," the second man said. "That ain't no odds." The man with the pipe walked away, and I asked the second man, "Who do you think will win?" "Ray," he said. "Ray, sure. He always win when the chips are down." I did not tell him about the statement of Colonel Stingo, whom I had encountered the day before and who had seen the films of the London bout in which Turpin defeated Robinson for the middleweight championship. The colonel said Turpin appeared to be a very strong boxer and had kept crowding Robinson from the beginning of the bout. "Ray has never looked too good against a crowding fighter," the colonel said, "and now he's getting old. He's got to make a different kind of a fight to win this one." He added that he had just been talking to Jack Kearns, the former manager of Jack Dempsey. Kearns had been out to Pompton Lakes to watch Sugar Ray train, and had said that he was dry, not sweating well, which is considered an indication of poor condition. "It'll take him a year to get back in shape," Kearns had told the colonel. "Paris licked him." When I arrived at the Polo Grounds a short time before the first preliminary bout, the place was only half full, but the people running the show had already effected an almost complete strangulation of movement as far as the customers were concerned. By setting up wire gates between various sections of the stand, probably to prevent ticket holders from creeping forward to better seats than they had paid for, they had made long detours necessary for anyone trying to get anywhere. Since even the ushers, of whom there were few, didn't know where the temporary barriers were, they couldn't tell people how to avoid them. A lane so narrow that it could be threaded only in single file had been left between the lower stand boxes and the first row of lower stand seats, and customers coming in through runways at the ends of this lane had to struggle against each other to reach the aisles leading up into the stands. Once I had made it to my own seat in the first row of the lower stand, the struggle provided a sort of preliminary to the preliminaries. The ringside seats, which covered the baseball diamond and reached well into the outfield, were for the most part empty at that stage of the evening. They filled slowly. Many of the people who buy them do not much like boxing, but go to big fights so that they can talk about them afterward, and they seldom arrive before the main bout. But I knew they would be along. This was something you had to see, like Guys and Dolls or a Van Gogh show at the Metropolitan. Midway through the preliminaries, hundreds of young hoodlums in Hawaiian shirts, all of whom had clearly come in on general admission, unless they had scaled the fence, dashed down the aisles of the stands in back of third base, vaulted the wire barriers with admirable ease, and hurtled onto the field, racing to occupy empty ringside seats. It was a concerted break, and there weren't nearly enough special cops to stop them. Once in a seat, each of these fellows would try to avoid attention until the rightful ticket holder arrived, upon which, after a conversational delaying action, the interloper would move to another empty seat, continuing to move until the lights went out for the main bout. Then, if evicted again, he would squat in an aisle. The specials were flushing them all through the show in a succession of comedy chases. The rush, because it was so concerted, did not amuse me. In a previous decade, and in other circumstances, the louts might have been wearing black or brown shirts, I thought, and a time might come when they would be again. The night was sweating hot. I could identify one ticket holder who was already in his seat. He was a man who looks like Ethel Waters, especially when he has his mouth open, and who calls himself Prince Monolulu. He says he is an Ethiopian prince and wears a bright red jacket embroidered with the Star of David and the signs of the zodiac, as well as a headdress of ostrich plumes and a set of flowing skirts. These make him fairly easy to recognize if you have seen him once, and I've seen him several times in England. Once at Epsom, plying his regular trade as a racetrack tout, and on endless Sundays at Hyde Park Corner, where he preaches Zionism. I had read in the morning paper that he'd come over on a chartered plane with 50 other Turpin supporters. When working, Prince Monolulu shouts at unpleasantly frequent intervals, "I got a 'orse!" And then, to those who gather around in response to his shouts, he tells about the dialogue between the Kammernickers and the nightgown, winding up by selling his horse on a folded slip of paper for a modest half-crown. I bought Black Tarquin from him at Epsom, and it beat 24 other horses, finishing 8th. At the Polo Grounds I noticed he was silent. He may have been molting. In the very first preliminary, one boy knocked the other down for a count of 9 in the first round, and the referee stopped the fight. This apparently exaggerated solicitude, I felt sure, could be attributed to the death of a preliminary fighter named Georgie Flores, who had been fatally injured when knocked out in Madison Square Garden a couple of weeks earlier. In another preliminary, Jackie Turpin, an older brother of the champions and a featherweight, defeated a boy named Walmsley in 6 rounds. Jackie is a light tan like his bigger brother, but on the night of this fight the resemblance ended there. I thought he boxed a bit like Jackie Kid Berg, an English lightweight of the 30s, getting inside fast and throwing dozens of punches, most of which landed, but none of which seemed solid. Still, the other boy went down for short counts twice, and Turpin earned the decision. I knew that somewhere in the stands there were 500 members of the Queen Elizabeth's crew, and the cheering for the featherweight Turpin showed where they were sitting, behind the third baseline. The semifinal was between 2 big Negro heavyweights, one of whom, apparently beaten, knocked the other out in the last 30 seconds. "How do you like that?" one of 2 Garment Center Corinthians on my right asked his companion. Just before he landed the winning punch, he was supremely out. Then the ring was full of fighters, the majority of them colored, being introduced to the crowd, and the belated ringside seat holders were pouring in, a number of pretty women with them. Jersey Joe Walcott, then the heavyweight champion, Ezzard Charles, his predecessor, and Joe Louis entered the ring together and were introduced one at a time. Louis got an ovation, although he was then just the champion before last. When he walked out on the field to his seat before the semi-final, he was given a bigger hand than General MacArthur, who preceded him. Louis looks like a champion and carries himself like a champion, and people will continue to call him champion as long as he lives. The 2 seats at my left, which had been vacant all evening, were now occupied by a couple. The girl, a smashing blonde in a backless black evening dress, must have expected that she was going to sit out in ringside, where people could see her. A woman somewhere behind her said, but not to her, "I call that a vulgar way to dress." It seemed to cheer the blonde, but the man with her looked uncomfortable. Everybody stood up for a long-recorded version of God Save the King, with a vocal chorus. It reminded me of the time they played the Marseillaise for Marcel Cerdan, before he knocked out Tony Zale in Jersey City, and the machine wouldn't stop. God Save the King received polite applause. The applause for the Star-Spangled Banner, which followed it, was tumultuous. The principals came into the ring. Robinson, the challenger, was first, tall, slender, and dark brown, wearing a blue and white robe. He discarded the robe, revealing white trunks with a blue stripe, and jigged furiously up and down to limber his leg muscles. Turpin followed in a yellow bathrobe over black trunks with a white stripe, sat down in his corner, and remained seated even during the introduction, while Robinson stood and waved to the crowd. Robinson acted like a young, nervous fighter. Turpin, 8 years his junior and fighting for the first time in this country, was calm as a Colchester oyster. When the bell rang, it was the same way. Robinson was making the play. Turpin wasn't crowding this time. He was taking it easy, as if sure Robinson would slow down. Jimmy Cannon of the New York Post wrote afterward that Turpin moved with a clumsy spryness and appeared to be serenely anticipating Robinson's collapse. The trouble with this policy was that it gave the much older Robinson a chance to make his own pace, fighting in spurts and then resting. He was still about the fastest thing in the world for 30 seconds or so, as Turpin was to find out. Turpin stood more like some of the illustrations of boxers in Boxiana than a modern fighter. He had his left knee far forward, the leg almost straight out, and all the weight of his body back. It made him hard to get at, but it also made it hard for him to get at Robinson. I had often wondered, looking at those illustrations, how men could hit from that position. Now I understand why Boxiana lists so many 50- and 60-round fights. When Turpin did hit, with marvelous speed, most of which was wasted in coming such a long way around, it was always at some curious angle. One punch for the body looked like a man releasing a bowling ball. Another, a right for the head, was like a granny boxing a boy's ears. His jab was like a man starting his run for the pole vault. If he hit conventionally, from the shoulder, he would be less disconcerting, but he might also be one of the hardest hitters in history, for he is the strongest middleweight I have ever seen. Built like a heavyweight, and tall, too. I haven't figured yet how he can be so big all around and still make 160 pounds. Turpin was so strong that his unconventional blows shook Robinson when they landed, although Robinson knew that, according to the book, they shouldn't. When the warning whistle blew 10 seconds before the beginning of the second round, Robinson stood up. I thought it was a rash gesture because it meant that now he would have to spend an extra 10 seconds on his feet at every interval. If he stayed down, it would be a public confession that he was tired. Turpin sat the full minute. "The kid's got nothing, absolutely nothing," one of the fellows next to me began saying during the 5th or 6th round, meaning Turpin, and he continued to repeat it like an incantation. Nothing. He must have had a good bet on Robinson because he sounded worried. "If Turpin hasn't got anything, what's Robinson got?" I finally asked him. "It's even, isn't it?" "Even?" He looked at me as if I were mad. "Turpin ain't took a round," he said. The referee's card had 4 rounds for each fighter and 1 even, up to the 10th round. A stout colored man in back of me was wearing a bright green suit, a tattersall waistcoat with a green stripe, a yellow tie, and a maroon silk shirt with 2-inch white polka dots. If he had taken off jacket, waistcoat, and about 40 pounds, he would have been dressed to ride for the Wolford Farm Stable of Kansas City, Missouri. Every time Sugar Ray started a punch, this man would grunt like a bullfrog and then softly moan, as if enduring the agony of a shattered Turpin, even when the punch didn't land. I was beginning to resent my neighbors bitterly by the time the 10th round came, and Robinson, with his eye cut, either by a butt or by a blow, put together the really amazing attack that finished poor Turpin off. Or didn't quite, according, next day, to Turpin's manager and to some of the British boxing writers, who hadn't been hit. When the referee stepped between the fighters and grabbed Turpin in his arms, I thought I had never seen a man so game or so beaten as the mulatto from Leamington Spa. Within a minute, the ring was full of policemen, who lined the ropes. I don't exactly know why, since there appeared to be no danger of a riot. There seemed to be nothing to argue about. On the way down the ramp to the exit, I saw a sight that struck the proper note. A tall, grave, fair-haired man with a pipe in his mouth, walking silently beside an equally grave blond boy of around 15, who was carrying a furled Union Jack. By contrast, as I got out onto 8th Avenue under the L, I nearly bumped into 3 men who turned out to be sailors from the Elizabeth. And though they were wearing Turpin buttons in the lapels of their land-going clothes, they were all laughing. "I feel like hiding my face," one of them was saying. "What a hiding he took." "What I'm laughing at," said another, "was old Bill here. 'Go right in, Randy,' he says. 'What are you afraid of?'" They were, I felt, devoid of proper patriotic sentiment. Since there were no taxis to be had and the subway entrances, choked with struggling human bodies, looked slightly less inviting in that heat than gas chambers, I started to foot-toddle down 8th Avenue, hoping to encounter a cab along the way. After I'd gone a block or so, I was stopped by another British seaman, a square-faced bloke who looked as if he might once have boxed a bit himself. He wanted to know the way to the entrance to the 8th Avenue subway I had just passed up. I told him, and added consolingly, "I never saw a gamer man than your fellow." "Oh, him," the seaman said. "He's a good lad, sir, but no experience, no defence, no class, sir. Forget about him." This, too, seemed hardly right. 8th Avenue from the Polo Grounds south is Harlem, but it's poor Harlem, unrelieved by bright lights or jive. I walked past storefronts fetid from the smell of old vegetables, and dismal houses that never were much and now are less, where ill-dressed Negroes sat on the door-sills. Other people walking from the fight, or perhaps a radio bulletin, had carried the news ahead of me. The fight itself, of course, hadn't been broadcast or televised, for New York audiences, at any rate. All along the way, the people in the doorways knew that Sugar Ray had won, but they didn't seem excited. Perhaps it was the heat. I stopped in at a bar at 145th Street for a drink. It was not festive there either, and then switched over to 7th Avenue, still looking for a taxi. At 143rd and 7th, 2 men in their 20s were bullying a boy of about 18. They had him backed up against an automobile, and whenever he turned on one, the other would kick him. A crowd of women had gathered around at a safe distance. The men had been drinking and looked rough. "You let him alone," a woman cried. "He's only a young boy." In a nearby saloon there was another row going on. Just then I sighted a cab headed uptown empty, and I stopped it and got aboard. "Drive me downtown past Sugar Ray's," I said. As we approached the Teresa, the avenue was so jammed up with traffic that we could barely move. People were packed around the safety islands and overflowed onto the street. Somebody was beating an oil can like a tom-tom, and a tall, limber man was dancing in the street. Any idea I may have had of stopping at Sugar Ray's for a nightcap left me when I saw the crowd in front of the door. My maid walked by Sugar Ray's a couple of days after the fight, and she said there were 25 Cadillacs parked in front of the place. "Any that weren't 1951 had to double park," she said. "His is a big pink one. He was standing outside with just a small patch over his eye, and everybody that came by shook hands with him." I went up to Sugar Ray's myself on the following Sunday, but it was very quiet, with only a girl about 5 feet tall behind the bar, and a monumental cash register, and a sign that read, "Try Sugar Ray's Bolo, 55 cents. The bolo, which is named after one of Robinson's favorite punches, is made of rum. There were enough customers to keep the girl busy, but they all looked tired, as if they had been celebrating for several nights in a row, and had just come in for pick-me-ups.